Can I just clarify, can you all hear me okay? Yep? Okay, good. So as Tim says, my name is Miro Griffiths. Very briefly, I am a PhD researcher at Liverpool John Moores University. My research explores how young people from marginalised backgrounds can engage in political activism, in protesting, in social movements, in a way to try and influence these agendas and directions. I'm also previously a government advisor to the Labour government and also to the coalition government on human rights and disability issues. And for a couple of years I worked as a project officer for a human rights NGO based in Europe, working with the European Commission and European Parliament to look at the impact of policies around human rights. Those issues will influence what I'm going to talk about. So I've been asked by Tim to think about an idea and then 5 reasons to support the idea, and I'll be using that framework for this talk. So my idea, I think when we come to the topic of disability, which is what I'll be focusing on today, disabled people's position in a post-Brexit UK is precarious to say the least. Accounts by prominent disabled activists and user-led organisations, reinforced by academic and grey literature, states that disabled people's quality of life, social position and rights will be undermined after Brexit. This will lead to disabled people experiencing further marginalisation than they do currently. To address this issue affecting disabled people, I think that we should be very mindful not to perceive disability as a separate issue. Many of our conversations, our discourse, our policies, agendas will focus on one particular narrative and then bolt disability on at the end. I think we should be looking at a different approach to this. I think we need to be able to frame disability alongside a desperate need to establish an inclusive society for all. So my argument or my idea is that our narratives to address the catastrophe surrounding Brexit must reshape the debate by offering a vision for a new and inclusive society which fundamentally places a shared European future in order to realise the vision. To do this, I believe we should be prioritising the demands and ideas put forward by young people, particularly young disabled people, in order to create ideas around societal development and functioning. So for too long, the discussions surrounding the UK's relationship to mainland Europe, including the various institutions and agencies, has become dominated by the economic arguments rather than people's social rights and protection from exclusion, isolation and oppression. So if we want progressive change towards an inclusive and socially just society, then we need to establish a vision that can offer this change to the majority. So in order to create the vision, we must prioritise supporting young disabled people to articulate their ideas for an inclusive society. This may seem fairly abstract, but I'm concerned that we're becoming stuck in this discourse or discussion with one side banging on about sovereignty and the other side being accused of trying to organise the United States of Europe. All that this will achieve will be further marginalisation and discrimination for vast contingents of our population. And I don't think we can afford to make tokenistic tweaks to our political and economic frameworks. What we require is a new vision with young people's ideas at the centre of this. So this turbulent time of change provides an opportunity to take control of the debate and work with young people from marginalised backgrounds to establish A, what is possible for Europe, and B, more importantly, what is preferred. Now, in order to defend this argument, or this idea, I'm going to draw on 5 reasons as to why this is necessary. The first one is the current political response. So if we look at the current government's response to disabled people and other marginalised groups, we see one of failure and contempt. Firstly, the UK government didn't react with horror regarding the concluding observations from the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the committee indicated that the austerity measures and the policies enacted by the British government has created a human catastrophe for disabled people. This has been dismissed outright by the current government, even though the pressure from the EU has been to address this issue. I also think there's a concern around our equality legislation. Many of our equality legislation mirrors the EU treaties, but the EU has demanded that we go further in trying to improve social protection for disabled people. Many of our policy, domestic policy, is on the basis of reasonable adjustments. The idea of reasonableness is subjective. One person will have one idea of reasonableness, another person will have another one. The idea of the EU and of the treaties was a way of safeguarding those issues. I'm also concerned that the current government since 2010 has called for, and I quote, to end the bias towards inclusion. So our government has categorically came out and said, we don't like the idea of inclusion for disabled people in all areas of society, and we want to remove this bias towards inclusion. I also think we should draw on some of the ideas provided by the likes in the House of Lords by Baroness Jane Campbell and Lord Lowe, who are two disabled peers, and their comments suggest there are deep concerns for disabled people's social position. That's my first point, to the current political response. My second point is to build from the EU's work. So, firstly, I think we need to make an acknowledgement and look to see how we can implement some of the ideas, or at least support some of the ideas that are on offer from the EU regarding the Accessibility Act. Now, the Accessibility Act provides common rules on accessibility in the EU, which will lead to a cost reduction for equipment and services for disabled people. It also leads to easier cross-border trading on technologies and devices for disabled people, and it opens up more of the market in order to provide accessible products and services. As I've noted, I don't think the EU treaties go far enough in protecting disabled people's rights, but what has fundamentally been available to us is this safeguarding or checks and balances in terms of when our issues for domestically haven't been addressed, we can draw on our European partners in order to highlight or support the work of many disabled activists and campaigners to protect disabled people's rights. I'm also concerned that we need to build on what the EU talks about in terms of their concerns for the idea of sovereignty. We have this notion coming out from those who do not support Brexit on the basis of sovereignty, that the sovereignty will be a wonderful opportunity to provide more power and authority to our government. The problem for disabled people is that the current government and many previous governments have showed us a contempt, as I said, for disabled people. So the idea of providing more power to such a state has deep concerns. I also think there's a problem around the topic of disability going through our conversations. In the EU referendum, there was very little coverage of the impact of Brexit on disabled people and their rights. Bar one hustings event in London, there were no other tailored events around disability, and bar the work of one prominent journalist, John Prings, from the Disability News Service, I did not see much coverage on the issue of disability. My third point is around the need to politicise young people's experiences. Supporting young people and children to explore their political views and be involved in the debates that affects them requires further thought. I can't talk about it now in detail, but we need to consider that within our work, what are we doing to provide inclusive approaches to ensure young people have opportunities to be part of this debate, to provide meaningful engagement and power to influence the direction of our conversations. If we don't do this, then we will have prominent areas of our community disregarded from these conversations. I also, as a sociologist, want to bring into the work of C.W. Mills, who's a prominent sociologist, because Mills talks about in the 50s and 60s, Mills talked about the argument that the focus on the individual's biography should be contextualized within the confines of the historical and political. So in other words, we need to be able to frame personal concerns as representation of political issues. For many people who are marginalized, we need to ensure that we take their personal experiences and extrapolate that to the problems that will be emerging from a post-Brexit. My fourth area is around reinvigorating a human rights approach. As I said previously, I'm concerned that much of the discussion is taking an economic platform and the social rights is getting abandoned. But history shows us that human rights has always been under threat. And actually, rights are only realised insofar that they contribute to the economic and political objectives of the state. So further sovereignty would lead to further issues around rights being undermined if they don't meet the agendas and the ideologies of the current government. Again, an issue that we need to address and celebrate from what we've had previously from the EU. I think that in terms of our work around the UN Charter and the EU treaties on human rights and also the UN conventions, We need to be able to celebrate that and bring that to the forward thinking in order to make reasonable, from our point of view, reasonable demands on our government to say, can these issues be embedded and protected going forward? My argument would be that they would not be able to do that, which gives us another opportunity to demand a reconsideration of the impact of Brexit. I also think there's something important about how we offer people an opportunity to discuss their experiences of marginalisation. I don't think we do this effectively. I don't think we do this enough. I think many people feel detached from these conversations and therefore are then open to being manipulated by those who offer very simplistic ideas to the complexity of what we're talking about. And my final area, which I've kind of framed as protecting certain principles, I think there's an issue around trying to highlight the great problems that we're encountering and bring them to the forefront of people's thoughts and feelings in everyday life as well. But in order to highlight this debate to those outside of this room, because again, I must make the point that a lot of my work, for example, doesn't reach the people who are very much opposed to my way of thinking. And I almost feel I'm always preaching to the converted, and we need to be able to take this discussion outside of the room and in order to bring people's thoughts and ideas into this. And to do that, we shouldn't strip away the complexity of what we're talking about. We should be providing skills and support for everybody to be able to enter this debate. I think we need to be able to demand, finally, more radical long-term objectives whilst also tackling the social justice issues in contemporary society in order to build this momentum going forward. So my call for action, I suppose, is that we need to create the idea for a future society within the present one and demonstrate the significance and importance of the EU in order to highlight the opportunities and the desperate need for having a shared European society and community going forward. So my three calls of action going forward would be, firstly, to promote what impact Brexit will have on marginalised communities, in particular disabled people. And I say that because disabled people represent the largest minority group in the entire world. All of us have a connection to disability in one way or another. And I think we need to highlight this in our arguments and in our articulation of trying to protect our status within the EU and also the benefits of the EU in order to try to ensure it resonates with everybody. I also think we need to identify people who could be part of this conversation and identify ways that we can actually reach those who are hardest to reach. And I think we need to capture the voices of marginalised people and young people in order to listen to their ideas as to how they want society to function, and then use that as part of our arguments and part of our ideas to make those demands upon those with power in order to say, well, if you can't provide us with this, then we need to go an alternative way. I'll stop there.